Hi guys, and welcome to edition 4 of my Covid Chronicles from Singapore, in which I'll just be talking about the latest happenings on the small island that I call home, and maybe just giving you an insight into what's been going on here if you're interested. Now it's been 5 days since the circuit breaker measures, or as I call it, partial lockdown, were introduced here in Singapore. Now, of course, the lockdown, as we've seen in other countries around the world, won't have an immediate effect on the number of cases of Covid-19 or the number of deaths, unfortunately. Although Singapore's doing pretty well so far in regard to deaths, they've only had 8 so far as of today. But we've seen a huge rise in the number of cases over the last month, which is why they've introduced the lockdown. I mean, look at the increase. A month ago, on March the 13th, we had only around 200 cases, and with today's updated figures, we now have almost 3,000, so that's a pretty big jump in just a month. So you can't blame the government for taking action and introducing the circuit breaker or lockdown. I mean, even in the 5 days since that was introduced, they've introduced new parts of the lockdown. For example, over the weekend they closed beaches and exercise facilities in parks, which up until the weekend had been open. So that's a bit of a bummer for me, because I like to go and exercise in the park and do sit-ups and push-ups, and I can't do that anymore. So I'm having to do that at home. So they've ramped up the measures in the last few days because, to be honest, I think Singapore had done so well in the first couple of months of the outbreak that people had become a bit complacent, to be honest. That's my opinion. And so when they introduced the circuit breaker lockdown last week, people were still carrying on as normal. So they've increased the measures now, and people are starting to take it a bit more seriously. For example, the wearing of masks is now mandatory on public transport and in various other places, such as shopping malls, convenience stores, and supermarkets, which is quite a relief to me, to be honest. As I mentioned in my last video, I suggested that supermarkets could possibly become a center for transmission, because supermarkets in Singapore are very small and the aisles are very narrow, so it's pretty impossible to avoid close contact with other people. So now that everybody's having to wear masks, I hope that situation will improve. But to be honest, my wife and I, we went shopping on Saturday, and we went to a supermarket that I kind of thought wouldn't be too busy because it's not really close to any residential areas. But when we got there, it didn't look busy, but once we got inside, it was crazy busy, and there was people everywhere inside, and it was really difficult to try and keep your distance from other people. Even though we had our masks on, I still wanted to keep away from people, but it was very difficult. So I didn't feel very comfortable in there. So we got in there, got our stuff as quickly as possible, and got out. So I'm of the opinion that it's still not working with supermarkets. So I think they'll have to limit the number of people that can go inside and basically enforce stricter distancing measures inside the shops. Because otherwise, knowing how contagious this virus is, it's at the present moment, I don't think the measures are good enough. So that's something that the government is going to have to consider, in my opinion. Another subject or topic related to coronavirus that I wanted to talk about today is punishment for breaking the rules of the lockdowns. and how Singapore, which has a reputation around the world for strict enforcement of laws, compares to where I'm from, the UK, which is also currently under a lockdown. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about the punishments and see how different they are. For example, on social distancing and being out when you're not supposed to, the punishment in the UK for a first offence is a £60 fine, which sounds a lot, but actually if you pay it within 2 weeks, it's actually reduced by 50% to £30. Compare that to Singapore, and starting this weekend, there are no more warnings for people breaking the social distancing measures. So if you get a ticket, it is 300 Singapore dollars for a first offence, and that's £170, so it's quite a lot more than the fines in the UK. Now, for reoffending, I believe the UK doubles the amount of the fine for every subsequent offence. So it's £60, then 120, then 180. Compare that to Singapore, and after the first offence, $300, the regulations don't state how much the fine is for a second offence, but I would imagine it's probably at least double. And then any further offences, you can possibly even be charged, and then you would have to go to court and you'd possibly get a prison sentence. So as you can see, Singapore has much more severe punishment for offenders, and also Singapore is probably a bit stricter in enforcing them than the authorities in the UK. Which country's method is better? Do you think it's better to have a large fine or a lower fine, like in the UK? Let me know in the comments what you think about the punishments. I mean, also, as you may know, Singapore is home to a lot of foreign or overseas workers or overseas residents. There's a good portion of the population here are not nationals. So they also have other forms of punishment. For example, even for locals, there was a case I mentioned in an earlier video about a guy who basically he was given a stay-at-home notice and he decided to leave the country. And then when he came back a couple of weeks later, he had his passport cancelled. So he can't travel anymore for the foreseeable future. I'm not sure how long the ban will last, but that's one form of punishment that the Singapore government will dish out to locals who disobey the rules. Now, for foreigners like myself or for people on work passes, if you transgress or break the rules, they will cancel your work permit, which basically means you no longer have a visa and a reason to stay in Singapore. So basically you're being deported, more or less, as I understand. You've got no job, you've got no reason to be here, you've got no visa anymore, so basically you have to leave. That's one of the stricter measures or punishments that they're bringing in to get people to comply with the local regulations. Now, you may think that's quite harsh, but when you compare Singapore to the UK, Singapore is a small place. It's only 50 kilometers across by about 30 kilometers north to south, and there are about 5 or 6 million people here. So the population density is very high, which means that this virus can spread really rapidly if it ever gains a big foothold. So obviously the government feels the need to be stricter in enforcing the rules, whereas the UK, although it's got a bigger population, it also has a much bigger landmass, and the population density away from London and Birmingham means that it's easier for people to keep their distance, and obviously easier to slow down the spread of COVID. So if you're looking at the reasons for the difference in the harshness of the punishments, that's possibly one explanation. Yes, so those are the things I really wanted to touch on today. The increased measures for the lockdown that have been introduced just 5 days after the lockdown began, and also the punishments you could expect if you break the rules regarding the lockdown. That's it for this video. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. If you have any questions about things going on in Singapore during the coronavirus outbreak, leave your questions in the comments and I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. For my next video in a few days' time, I might do a feature on the things that we're doing as a family to keep busy during the lockdown. Just a bit of light entertainment to keep things less serious. Yeah, so stick around for the next video. That's it for today. Take it easy, stay safe, and until next time, over and out.